Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we're going to continue our reading of one of the fairy tales of George MacDonald, The Day Boy and the Night Girl, about a boy and a girl, now a young man and woman, who were raised by a witch, the one to never know night, the other to never know day. But they have, of course, now met. But it's night, and the boy is not coping. "Come, come, you must," said Nycteris, "or I shall have to pretend to leave you to make you come. I've seen the green eyes you speak of, and I will take care of you from them." "You? How can you do that? If it were day now, I could take care of you from the worst of them, but as it is, I can't even see them for this abominable darkness. I could not see your lovely eyes but for the light that is in them, that lets me see straight into heaven through them. There are windows into the very heaven beyond the sky. I believe they are the very place where the stars are made." "You come then, or I shall shut them," said Nycteris, "and you shan't see them any more till you are good. Come, if you can't see the wild beasts, I can." "You can? And you ask me to come?" cried Photogen. "Yes," answered Nycteris, "and more than that, I see them long before they can see me, so that I am able to take care of you." "But how?" persisted Photogen. "You can't shoot with bow and arrow or stab with a hunting knife." "No, but I can keep out of the way of them all. Why, just when I found you, I was having a game with 2 or 3 of them at once. I see and scent them, too, long before they're near me, long before they can see or scent me." "You don't see or scent any now, do you?" said Photogen uneasily, rising on his elbow. "No, none at present. I will look," replied Nycteris, and sprang to her feet. Oh, do not leave me, not for a moment!" cried Photogen, straining his eyes to keep her face in sight through the darkness. "Be quiet, or they will hear you," she returned. "The wind is from the south, and they cannot scent us. I found out all about that. Ever since the dear dark came, I have been amusing myself with them, getting every now and then just into the edge of the wind, and letting one have a sniff of me." "Oh, horrible!" cried Photogen. "I hope you will not insist on doing so any more. What was the consequence?" "Always, the very instant, he turned with flashing eyes and bounded toward me, only he could not see me, you must remember. But my eyes being so much better than his, I could see him perfectly well, and would run away round him until I scented him, and then I knew he could not find me anyhow. If the wind were to turn and run the other way now, there might be a whole army of them down upon us, leaving no room to keep out of their way. You'd better come." She took him by the hand. He yielded and rose, and she led him away. But his steps were feeble, and as the night went on, he seemed more and more ready to sink. "Oh dear, I'm so tired and so frightened," he would say. "Lean on me," Nycteris would return, putting her arm round him or patting his cheek. "Take a few steps more. Every step away from the castle is clear gain. Lean harder on me. I'm quite strong and well now." They went on. The piercing night eyes of Nycteris descried not a few pairs of green ones gleaming like holes in the darkness, and many a round she made to keep far out of their way, but she never said to Photogen she saw them. Carefully she kept him off the uneven places, and on the softest and smoothest of the grass, talking to him gently all the way as they went, of the lovely flowers and the stars, how comfortable the flowers looked down in their green beds, how happy the stars up in their blue beds. When the morning began to come, he began to grow better, but was dreadfully tired from walking instead of sleeping, especially after being so long ill. Nycteris, too, what with supporting him, what with growing fear of the light which was beginning to ooze out of the east, was very tired. At length, both equally exhausted, neither was able to help the other. As if by consent, they stopped. Embracing each other, they stood at the midst of a wide grassy land, neither of them able to move a step, each supported only by the leaning weakness of the other, each ready to fall if the other should move. But while the one grew weaker, the other had begun to grow stronger. When the tide of the night began to ebb, the tide of the day began to flow, and now the sun was rushing to the horizon, borne upon its foaming billows. And ever as he came, Photogen revived. At last the sun shot up into the air like a bird from the hand of the Father of Lights. Nycteris gave a cry of pain and hid her face in her hands. "Oh me," she sighed, "I'm so frightened. The terrible light stings so." But the same instant, through her blindness, she heard Photogen give a low, exultant laugh, and the next felt herself caught up, She who all night long had tended and protected him like a child was now in his arms, borne along like a baby, with her head lying on his shoulder. But she was the greater, for suffering more, she feared nothing. 19. The Werewolf. At the very moment when Photogen caught up Nycteris, the telescope of Watho was angrily sweeping the tableland. She swung it from her in rage, and running to her room, shut herself up. There she anointed herself from top to toe with a certain ointment, shook down her long red hair, and tied it round her waist. Then began to dance, whirling round and round, faster and faster, growing angrier and angrier, until she was foaming at the mouth with fury. When Falco went looking for her, she could not find her anywhere. As the sun rose, the wind slowly changed and went round until it blew straight from the north. Photogen and Nycteris were drawing near the edge of the forest, Photogen still carrying Nycteris, when she moved a little on his shoulder uneasily and murmured in his ear, "I smell a wild beast, that way, the wind is coming." Photogen turned, looked back toward the castle, and saw a dark speck on the plain. As he looked, it grew larger. It was coming across the grass with the speed of the wind. It came nearer and nearer. It looked long and low, but that might be because it was running at a great stretch. He set Nycteris down under a tree in the black shadow of its bole, struck his bow, and picked out his heaviest, longest, sharpest arrow. Just as he set the notch on the string, he saw that the creature was a tremendous wolf rushing straight at him. He loosened his knife in its sheath, drew another arrow halfway from the quiver, lest the first should fail, and took his aim, at a good distance, to leave time for a second chance. He shot. The arrow rose, flew straight, descended, struck the beast, and started again into the air, doubled like a letter V. Quickly Photogen snatched the other, shot, cast his bow from him, and drew his knife. But the arrow was in the brute's chest, up to the feather. It tumbled heels over head with a great thud of its back on the earth, gave a groan, made a struggle or two, and lay stretched out motionless. "I've killed it, Nycteris," cried Photogen. "It is a great red wolf." "Oh, thank you," answered Nycteris feebly from behind the tree. "I was sure you would. I was not a bit afraid." Photogen went up to the wold. It was a monster. But he was vexed that his first arrow had behaved so badly, and was the less willing to lose the one that had done him such good service. With a long and a strong pull, he drew it from the brute's chest. Could he believe his eyes? There lay no wolf, but Watho, with her hair tied round her waist. The foolish witch had made herself invulnerable, as she supposed, but had forgotten that to torment Photogen therewith she had handled one of his arrows. He ran back to Nycteris and told her. She shuddered and wept and would not look. Chapter 20. All is well. There was now no occasion to fly a step farther. Neither of them feared anyone but Watho. They left her there and went back. A great cloud came over the sun, and rain began to fall heavily, and Nycteris was much refreshed, grew able to see a little, and with Photogen's help walked gently over the cool, wet grass. They had not gone far before they met Fargu and the other huntsman. Photogen told them he had killed a great red wolf, and it was Madame Watho. The huntsman looked grave, but gladness shone through. "Then," said Fargu, "I will go and bury my mistress." But when they reached the place, they found she was already buried in the maws of sundry birds and beasts which had made their breakfast of her. Then Fargu, overtaking them, would very wisely have Photogen go to the king and tell him the whole story. But Photogen, yet wiser than Fargu, would not set out until he had married Nycteris. For then, he said, the king himself can't part us, and if ever two people couldn't do the one without the other, those two are Nycteris and I. She has got to teach me to be a brave man in the dark, and I've got to look after her until she can bear the heat of the sun, and he helps her to see instead of blinding her. They were married that very day, and the next day they went together to the king and told him the whole story. But whom should they find at the court but the father and mother of Photogen, both in high favor with the king and queen. Aurora nearly died for joy, and told them all how Watho had lied and made her believe her child was dead. No one knew anything of the father or mother of Nycteris, But when Aurora saw in the lovely girl her own azure eyes shining through night and its clouds, it made her think strange things, and wonder how even the wicked themselves may be a link to join together the good. Through Watho, the mothers, who had never seen each other, had changed eyes in their children. The king gave them the castle and lands of Watho, and there they lived and taught each other for many years that were not long. But hardly had one of them passed before Nycteris had come to love the day best, because it was the clothing and crown of Photogen, and she saw that the day was greater than the night, and the sun more lordly than the moon. And Photogen had come to love the night best, because it was the mother and home of Nycteris. But who knows, Nycteris would say to Photogen, that when we go out we shall not go into a day as much greater than your day as your day is greater than my night. The end. But now we begin another fairy tale by George MacDonald, The Carasoyn. In case you are not familiar with Scottish, I should tell you for this that a burn is a little mountain brook. The Carasoyn. 1. The mountain stream. Once upon a time there lived in a valley in Scotland a boy about 12 years of age, the son of a shepherd. His mother was dead, and he had no sister or brother. His father was out all day on the hills with his sheep, but when he came home at night he was as sure of finding the cottage neat and clean, the floor swept, a bright fire, and his supper waiting for him, as if he had had wife and daughter to look after his household instead of only a boy. Therefore, although Colin could only read and write and knew nothing of figures, he was 10 times wiser and more capable of learning anything than if he had been at school all his days. He was never at a loss when anything had to be done. Somehow he always blundered into the straight road to his end, while another would be putting his shoes on looking for it. And yet all the time that he was busiest working, he was busiest building castles in the air. I think the two ought always to go together. And so Colin was never overworked, but had plenty of time to himself. In winter he spent it in reading by the fireside, or carving pieces of wood with his pocket-knife, and in summer he always went out for a ramble. His great delight was in a little stream which ran down the valley from the mountains above. Up this burn he would wander every afternoon with his hands in his pockets. He never got far, however, he was so absorbed in watching its antics. Sometimes he would sit on a rock, staring at the water as it hurried through the stones, scolding, expostulating, muttering, and always having its own way. Sometimes he would stop by a deep pool and watch the crimson-spotted trouts darting about as if their thoughts and not their tails sent them where they wanted to go. And when he stopped at the little cascade, tumbling smooth and shining over a hollowed rock, he seldom got beyond it. But there was one thing which always troubled him. It was that when the stream came near the cottage, it could find no other way than through the little yard where stood the cow-house and the pigsty, and there, not finding a suitable channel, spread abroad in a disconsolate manner, becoming rather a puddle than a brook, all defiled with the treading of the cloven feet of the cow and the pigs. In fact, it looked quite lost and ruined, so that even after it had with much labor got out of the yard again, it took a long time to gather itself together, and not quite succeeding, slipped away as if ashamed, with spent forces and poverty-stricken speed, till at length, meeting the friendly help of a rivulet coming straight from the hills, it gathered heart and bounded on afresh. "It can't be all that the cow drinks that makes the difference," said Colin to himself. "The pigs don't care about it. I do believe it's affronted at being dashed about. The cow isn't dirty, but she's rather stupid and inconsiderate. The pigs are dirty. Something must be done. Let me see." He reconnoitered the whole ground. Upon the other side of the house was all rock, through which he could not cut, and he was forced to the conclusion that the only other course for the stream to take lay right through the cottage. To most engineers this would have appeared the one course to be avoided, but Colin's heart danced at the thought of having his dear burn running right through the house. How cool it would be all the summer, how convenient for cooking, how handy at meals. And then the music of it, how it would tell him stories and sing him to sleep at night. What a companion it would be when his father was away, and then he could bathe in it when he liked. In winter, to be sure, but winter was a long way off. The very next day his father went to the fair, so Colin set to work at once. It was not such a very difficult undertaking, for the walls of the cottage and the floor as well were of clay, the former nearly sun-dried into a brick and the latter trampled hard, but still both assailable by pickaxe and spade. He cut through the walls and dug a channel along the floor, letting in stones in the bottom and sides. After it got out of the cottage and through the small garden in front, it should find its own way to the channel below, for here the hill was very steep. The same evening his father came home. "What have you been about, Colin?" he asked in great surprise when he saw the trench in the floor. "Wait a minute, father," said Colin, "till you've got your supper, and then I'll tell you." So when his father was seated at the table, Colin darted out, and hurrying up to the stream, broke through the bank just in the place whence a natural hollow led straight to the cottage. The stream dashed out like a wild creature from a cage, faster than he could follow, and shot through the wall of the cottage. His father gave a shout, and when Colin went in, he found him sitting with his spoon halfway to his mouth, and his eyes fixed on the muddy water that rushed foaming through his floor. "It will soon be clean, father," said Colin, "and then it will be so nice." His father made no answer, but continued staring. Colin went on with a long list of the advantages of having a brook running through your house. At length his father smiled and said, "You're a curious creature, Colin, but why shouldn't you have your fancies as well as older people? We'll try it a while, and then we'll see about it." The fact was, Colin's father had often thought what a lonely life the boy's was, and it seemed hard to take from him any pleasure he could have. So out rushed Colin at the front to see how the brook would take the shortest way headlong down the hill to its old channel, and to see it go tumbling down that hill was a sight worth living for. "It is a mercy," said Colin. "It has no neck to break, or it would break 20 times in a minute. It flings itself from rock to rock right down just as I should like to do if it weren't for my neck." All that evening he was out and in without a moment's rest, now up to the beginning of the cut, now following the stream down to the cottage, then through the cottage and out again at the front door to see it dart across the garden and dash itself down the hill. At length his father told him he must go to bed. He took one more peep at the water, which was running quite clear, and now obeyed. His father followed him presently. 2. The Fairy Fleet. The bed was about a couple of yards from the edge of the brook, and as Colin was always first up in the morning, he slept at the front of the bed. So he lay for some time gazing at the faint glimmer of the water and the dull red light from the sod-covered fire, and listening to its sweet music as it hurried through the night again, till its murmur changed into a lullaby and sung him fast asleep. Soon he found he was coming awake again. He was lying listening to the sound of the busy stream. But it had gathered more sounds since he went to sleep, amongst the rest one of the boards knocking together, and a tiny chattering and sweet laughter like the tinkling of heather bells. He opened his eyes. The moon was shining along the brook, lighting the smoky rafters above with its reflection from the water, which had been dammed back at its outlet from the cottage so that it lay bank full and level with the floor. But its surface was hardly to be seen, save by an occasional glimmer, for the crowded boats of a fairy fleet which had just arrived. The sailors were as busy as sailors could be, mooring along the banks and running their boats high and dry on the shore. Some had little sails which glimmered white in the moonshine, half lowered or blowing out in the light breeze that crept down from the course of the stream. Some were pulling about the rest, oars flashing, tiny voices calling, tiny feet running, tiny hands hauling at ropes that ran through the blocks of shining ivory. On the shore stood groups of fairy ladies in all colors of the rainbow, green predominating, waited upon by gentlemen all in green, but with red and yellow feathers in their caps. The Queen had landed on the side next to Colin, and in a few minutes more 20 dances were going at once along the shores of the fairy river. And there lay great Colin's face just above the bedclothes, glowering at them like an ogre. At last, after a few dances, he heard a clear, sweet, ringing voice say, "I've had enough of this. I'm tired of doing like the big people. Let's have a game of hey cockalorum jig." That instant every group sprang asunder, and every fairy began a frolic on his own account. They scattered all over the cottage, and Colin lost sight of most of them. While he lay watching the antics of the two of those near him, who behaved more like clowns at a fair than like gentlemen, the gentlemen they had been a little while before, He heard a voice close to his ear, but though he looked everywhere about his pillow, he could see nothing. The voice stopped a moment the moment he began to look, but began again as soon as he gave it up. "You can't see me. I'm talking to you through a hole in the head of your bed." Colin knew the knothole well enough. "Don't look," said the voice. "If the Queen sees me, I shall be pinched. Oh, please don't." The voice sounded as if its owner would cry presently, so Colin took good care not to look. It went on, "Please, I'm a little girl, not a fairy. The Queen stole me the minute I was born, 7 years ago, and I can't get away. I don't like the fairies. They're so silly, and they never grow any wiser. I grow wiser every year. I want to get back to my own people. They won't let me. They make me play at being somebody else all night long and sleep all day. That's what they do themselves. And I should so like to be myself. The Queen says that's not the way to be happy at all, but I do want very much to be a little girl. Do take me." "How am I to get you?" asked Colin in a whisper, which sounded, after the sweet voice of the changeling, like the wind in a field of dry beans. "The Queen is so pleased with you that she's sure to offer you something. Choose me. Here she comes." Immediately he heard another voice, shriller and stronger, in front of him, and looking about saw standing on the edge of the bed a lovely little creature with a crown glittering with jewels and a rush for a sceptre in her hand, the blossom of which shone like a bunch of garnets. "You great staring creature," she said, "your eyes are much too big to see with. What clumsy hobgoblins you thick folk are." So saying, she laid her wand across Colin's eyes. "Now then, stupid," she said. And that instant Colin saw the room like a huge barn full of creatures about 2 feet high. The beams overhead were crowded with fairies, playing all imaginable tricks, scrambling everywhere, knocking over each other, throwing dust and soot in each other's faces, grinning from behind corners, dropping on each other's necks, and tripping up each other's heels. 2 had got hold of an empty eggshell, and coming behind one sitting on the edge of the table and laughing at someone on the floor, tumbled it right over him so he was lost in the cavernous hollow. But the lady fairies mingled in none of these rough pranks. Their tricks were always more graceful, and they had more to say than to do. But the moment the Queen had laid her wand across his eyes, she went on, "Know, son of a human mortal, that thou hast pleased the Queen of the fairies. Lady as I am over the elements, I cannot have everything I desire. One thing thou hast given me. Years have I longed for a path down this rivulet to the ocean below. Your horrid farmyard, ever since your great-grandfather built this cottage, was the one obstacle. For we fairies hate dirt, not only in houses, but in fields and woods as well, and above all in running streams. But I can't talk like this any longer. I tell you what, you are a dear good boy, and you shall have what you please. Ask me for anything you like." "May it please your Majesty," said Colin very deliberately, "I want a little girl that you carried away some 7 years ago the moment she was born. May it please your Majesty, I want her." "It does not please my Majesty," cried the Queen, whose face had been growing very black. "Ask for something else." "Then whether it please your Majesty or not," said Colin bravely, "I hold your Majesty to your word. I want that little girl, and that little girl I will have, and nothing else." "You dare to talk so to me, you thick?" "Yes, your Majesty." "Then you shan't have her." "Then I'll turn the brook right through the dunghill," said Colin. "Do you think I'll let you come into my cottage to play at high-jinks as you please if you behave like this to me?" And Colin sat up in bed and looked the Queen in the face. As he did so, he caught sight of the loveliest little creature peeping round the corner at the foot of the bed, and he knew she was the little girl, because she was quiet and looked frightened and was sucking her thumb. Then the Queen, seeing with whom she had to deal, and knowing that queens in fairyland are bound by their word, began to try another plan with him. She put on her sweetest manner and looks, and as she did so, the little face at the foot of the bed grew more troubled, and the little head shook itself, and the little thumb dropped out of the mouth. "Dear Colin," said the Queen, "you shall have the girl, but you must do something for me first." The little girl shook her head as fast as ever she could, but Colin was taken up with the Queen. "To be sure I will. What is it?" he said. And so he was bound by a new bargain, and was in the Queen's power. "You must fetch me a bottle of Carasoyn," she said. "What is that?" asked Colin. "A kind of wine that makes people happy." "Why, are you not happy already?" "No, Colin," answered the Queen with a sigh. "You have everything you want, "Except the Carasoyn," returned the queen. "You do whatever you like and go wherever you please." "That's just it. I want something I neither like nor please, that I don't know anything about. I want a bottle of Carasoyn." And here she cried like a spoilt child, not like a sorrowful woman. "But how am I to get it?" "I don't know. You must find out." "Oh, that's not fair!" cried Colin. But the queen burst into a fit of laughter that sounded like the bells of 100 frolicking sheep, and bounded away to the side of the river, jumped on the board of her boat. And like a swarm of bees gathered the courtiers and sailors, 2 creeping out of the bellows, 1 at the nozzle, the other at the valve, 3 out of the basket hilt of the broadsword on the wall, 6 all white out of the meal tub, and so from all parts of the cottage to the riverside. And amongst them Colin spied the little girl creeping on board the queen's boat, with her pinafore to her eyes, and the queen was shaking her fist at her. In 5 minutes more they had all scrambled into the boats, and the whole fleet was in motion down the stream. In another moment the cottage was empty, and everything had returned to its usual size. "They'll be all dashed to pieces on the rocks," cried Colin, jumping up and running into the garden. When he reached the fall, there was nothing to be seen but the swift plunge and rush of the broken water in the moonlight. He thought he heard cries and shouts coming from below, and fancied he could distinguish the sobs of the little maiden whom he'd so foolishly lost. But the sounds might be only those of the water, for to the different voices of running streams there is no end. He followed its course all the way to its old channel, but saw nothing to indicate any disaster. Then he crept back to his bed, where he lay thinking what a fool he had been, till he cried himself to sleep over the little girl who would never grow into a woman. But of course, Colin will take steps, and we'll see what they are next time.